Good evening, David. It's extremely nice to see you. Thank you very much for joining us. A quick introduction to Earth.org. Earth.org is a not-for-profit environmental organization based in Hong Kong. We aim to bring attention to what's happening to the natural ecosystems worldwide. We advocate for sustainable economic policies to protect the natural environment and an extension of governance or oversight to cover the global commons. With Earth.org Talks, we're engaging with inspiring change makers and thought leaders to share their opinion and knowledge with our global audience to bring attention to what we humans are doing to our planet. For our audience, I'd like to welcome David Pogue. David is an American technology and science writer and TV presenter. He's an Emmy-winning correspondent for CBS News Sunday Morning and an author of Crowdwise column in the New York Sunday Times Smarter Living section. In addition to countless academic publications, research papers, and other articles, he's written more than 10 books, I think many more than 10 books, including most recently, How to Prepare for Climate Change, a practical guide to surviving the chaos. I think it's fair to say that perhaps you're not overly optimistic about our prospects, but I wanted to ask the question as an opener: do you think the human race is sleepwalking into a kind of hell on earth?
Sleepwalking, no, because I feel as though in the last 2 years there's been a lot of waking up. We here elected a president who campaigned in every speech he gave on the premise of doing something about climate change, and to the extent politically he's able to, he's made big progress in a very short amount of time. And I feel like corporations all over the world are very quickly changing their ways under pressure from investors and consumers and their own employees. So I think the older, calcified, corrupt corporate people are dying out, and the younger people who care and are willing to accept change and make change are gradually taking over. I think that when I speak on this topic, a lot of people see it as a black or white, heaven or hell, survive or die situation. I don't think that's the way the world works. It's a spectrum, right? The IPCC even has extreme outcome, medium outcome, best outcome. It's a sliding scale. So the question is, how fast will we decarbonize? How bad will the damage be that we've already unleashed? And I think it's going to be maybe 50, 80 years, something like that. But I do think we will decarbonize. We will not see in our lifetimes or our children's lifetimes or our grandchildren's lifetimes the weather the way it was in the 1980s. But that doesn't mean that we will all be in a hell on earth. There'll be some parts of the world are in deep trouble. That is true, but not everyone.
Yeah, I think we'll come back to that, especially around conflict, because I think you gave that some coverage. What do you think are the greatest risks that face humanity today? Are these risks evolving? And you've kind of touched on this, but are they evolving in the public eye, do you think, to become more universally recognized existential threats?
I do. Here in the States, we have a Yale University study that goes out every year to measure the changing viewpoints of Americans. And I'm, as a liberal, progressive, environmentalist American, I'm unbelievably frustrated by how many of my countrymen took so long to recognize the problem and denied that there was a problem. But the numbers are very different this year. The number of Americans who, well, first of all, when we talk about climate deniers, I actually think they've gone extinct. I really think that the number of people who will tell you nothing is going on with the climate, I think that's a vanishingly small number. You look out the window, you see it. Now what we have are people saying, yeah, the climate changed, but it's not human related. It's not something that we did. It's a natural cycle. And even those numbers are getting smaller. In the most recent Yale poll, it was 29% of Americans think this is part of a natural cycle. And just for a point of reference, 25% of Americans believe that aliens walk among us. So if you can get over 50% of Americans to believe anything, you're doing pretty well. So I do think attitudes are quickly changing around the world. And for example, the electrification of cars, which is happening really fast here in the States, not as fast as Europe, but this year in particular, it's making it possible to believe that there is economic growth and jobs available even in this massive act of decarbonization. So I think that is what's been holding a lot of conservative people back, as they think it's going to cost business and cost the money. I think we're slowly going to see that's not necessarily true.
Yeah, I think there's a whole very interesting subject around discussion subject maybe for another time, but around inertia. So when such a large organization has so much weight, in the center, kind of keeping it one way, even though the head may want to go in a different direction, even though parts of the body want to go in a different direction, that kind of inertia in the middle is something that's been a real problem. Not of course, not helped by certain individuals who have enormous wealth and power in media and in other sectors who've been particularly, unhelpful, I suppose, in this respect. And I had a question, which I'll just pop in now, which is, do you think in the future crimes of knowingly spreading disinformation, crimes of knowingly continuing practices which are damaging the environment, do you think that they will become criminalized?
Wow. I don't, in this world, anything seems possible that didn't once seem possible. I don't see it as anything imminent, because every generation looks back on its grandparents and says, they were so dumb. They didn't know what they were doing. I mean, we didn't have plastic until the 50s. Your grandparents, my grandparents, grew up in a world without any plastic at all. I mean, that's astonishing to think of, but there was no plastic until the 50s. So do we sue them? Do we criminalize them for not realizing what they were unleashing at the time? No, because they were doing the best they could with the materials they had in the moment. And it's the same thing with the Industrial Revolution. At the time, it was a vast leap forward in productivity and quality of life and wealth for everybody. They couldn't see the end point of this. So I'm not sure it's really their fault. So you can't really criminalize what people think in their most well-meaning ways. And I want to take a quick detour on this topic that I think will blow your mind. I did a book proposal on fear, on the biology of fear. And do you know, there was a study that showed that people who self-identify as politically conservative have larger amygdalas. That's the fear center of your brain. It's enlarged in conservative voters and shrunken in liberal voters. This is a physiological, measurable size difference. Now, we don't know for sure what's the cause and what's the effect. Do liberals' amygdalas shrink because they are fearless and don't fear change? Do conservatives' amygdalas get bigger because they are so afraid of the world? Or are they afraid of the world because they have big amygdalas? Nobody knows that. But it is true that people who fear change and people who want change are very different brain beings. And that I think can let both sides a little bit off the hook and give each side a little bit of understanding into the other. We're not idiots. We just can't help it.
Interesting, very interesting topic. Nature, nurture, genetics, whether it plays a part. Yeah, we'd love to come back to that. In your book, I think you open with a kind of really succinct quotation, which is from John Holdren. We basically have three choices: mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. We're going to do some of each. The question is, what is the mix going to be?
Yeah, and that's really the premise of this book. My book is called How to Prepare for Climate Change, and the entire book is dedicated to the second part of Holdren's quote, adaptation. I counted 200 books on sale at Amazon.com about mitigation, about making your carbon footprint smaller. And yes, we all need to do that. Yes, of course, corporations need to do it, governments need to do it, individuals need to do it. But there's a second half of the way to approach climate change that no one talks about, and that's adaptation. I mean, businesses and governments and large institutions talk about adaptation. Building a seawall is adaptation. Cultivating drought-resistant seeds is adaptation. And so big institutions do this. But this book is dedicated to the premise, what can you do, the individual? You're not going to build a seawall this weekend. You need smaller human steps to protect yourself and your family against what's coming.
When I was looking at your career, I had a really interesting kind of realization. I mean, you've written a book a lot about science. There's a huge amount of fact and depth and analysis of the issues. That must have been a pretty deep dive. I know I was reading the acknowledgements in the back. You had a bit of great help, but there must have been, I mean, presumably you're already interested in the subject, but you really took a dive into this.
That's very insightful. I was not a climate scientist when I started out. This wasn't a field of expertise. And, this book covers all the conceivable adaptation topics: where to invest, how to insure, how to reinforce your home, how to talk to your children, what you can grow in a garden, and then individual chapters on surviving flood, hurricane, sea level rise, fire, and so on. I'm not an expert on any of those topics, but I am a reporter. So my thought was, if I interview the right people and spend long enough doing that, that I can adequately represent what they say through my writer's lens. So you're right. This entire book was an experiment in research. Interviewed 55 great experts on all these topics, and that's where the information came from, not from my own brain.
Having gone through that, what was the biggest surprise?
I think the biggest surprise was, what we opened with today, which is that it's much less black and white than you think. There is so much nuance and complexity both directions. I mean, the situation with the changing weather is much worse than anybody thinks, but also much better than anybody thinks. And what I mean by that is, there's a lot of resilience in nature, and there's a lot of resilience in us. And there are a lot of minds that are changing very quickly. We as a species, we don't change on a dime, as you mentioned, inertia. So the fact that so many people are changing their lives and electing officials and adopting new corporate goals so quickly shows you that maybe after these decades of lag, there is suddenly a lot of hope. There is a lot of progress being made. Obviously, it's too late. We're not going to have the weather we did growing up as children. But it's for something that's going to involve a complete rethink of the way we live. It's a lot going on very quickly.
Yeah, on that point, I'm a relative optimist. I wouldn't say I was a techno optimist. I'm hoping for the best. But I think, like many, we have seen quite fast and really quite dramatic transformations in certain sectors, which at the time looked impossible, but then actually were much faster than anyone realized or could expect or could have hoped for. So I think on the decarbonization, I'm hopeful. Given the fact that there'll probably be one or two holdouts, and it depends how big those holdouts are in terms of countries. And that's, especially with everything that's going on in the world today. But there's quite a lot of elephants in the room. And I think, like you said, something can't be stopped. And one thing that struck me out of several of my conversations has been around ocean acidification. And that time lag is pretty terrifying. And, would you say it seems to be just one of the many elephants in the room? What are your thoughts on feedback loops, on this kind of perhaps less spoken about issues?
Apologies about Wilbur the cat, those of you who are watching on video.
It's great to have a guest.
He's here to represent nature. The ocean is a big problem because it can change, but it is a very slow change. It's a battleship turning around and not a rowboat. And as I'm sure climate fans know, of the amount that the Earth has heated up, 93% of it is in the ocean. So it will take a lifetime to cool down again or more. And that, you're right, that drives acidification, death of coral, death of species. A lot of it, again, we can console ourselves with the resilience issue. I mean, there are schools of eatable fish that simply shift north to escape the warmth, to stay, in the kind of water that they prefer. But there will be species die off. There has been species die off since we, the people, came along. For better or worse, it's been an ongoing process for a long time. So it's about adaptation now. It's about admitting that some lines have been crossed, that some things cannot be rewound in our lifetimes, and what are we going to do about it?
Do you think parts of the US will become too hot to live?
Yes. Already in Phoenix, Arizona, people carry oven mitts in their car glove compartments because the steering wheel is too hot to touch. A couple of years ago, they had to stop flying out of Phoenix, Arizona, because the air was so hot. It was too thin to provide lift over the aircraft wings. So they had to ground the airplanes. I would say that there will always be air conditioning and condominiums and cars. I don't think there will be uninhabitable, but I do think that it will be very, very rare and difficult for people who have outside jobs, construction, athletes, what have you. It's just going to become simply too hot and dangerous for people to spend much time outside. It doesn't seem like it's the kind of thing where people will abandon these areas completely, but it's not going to be any kind of normal life as we view it today.
Yeah, I'm just reading Kim Stanley Robinson at the moment. I don't know if you've which begins this way. With air conditioners humming away, people trying to avoid the heat, people sitting in lakes. It's this type of dystopic vision, which I think is how he starts his book, and I'm not far into it, but yeah, it's. We've also spoken about other parts of the world, some of which are kind of almost too hot to live already. But if you look at where some of those likely areas are, India, Pakistan, the Middle East, there's a lot of potential conflicts there. And I think you touched on this issue around migration. First off, do you think we'll begin to see patterns of internal migration within the US? You spend quite a lot of pages and chapters talking about cities that could be good places to move to. Do you think, within this decade, do you think you'll see a sort of slight trend emerging of people voting with their feet, putting their stuff into a truck and moving?
To a certain extent, it's underway. In the last 3 years, there's been gigantic emigration out of California. And it was the wildfires that did it. The wildfires and the drought. People are just done. They're like, we're not doing this anymore. And we're talking about, progressive liberal cities like San Francisco, where the air in September 2019 was brown orange from the wildfire smoke. There was a run on air conditioners and air purifiers. You couldn't buy them unless you paid thousands of dollars in premiums. So the Californians are already fleeing. What's astonishing is how slow Florida and Arizona and Texas are to comprehend what's happening. In large part, those are the 3 states that are gaining population right now as of 2022. I interviewed a bunch of real estate agents, and they are baffled. I mean, they are absolutely mystified as how people can just, I guess, we evolved to be afraid of the imminent threat that we can see. The saber-toothed tiger is right there. And we are so bad at appreciating dangers that are slow and intermittent, like climate change, obesity, smoking, saving for retirement. All of these things we're terrible at because our Neanderthal brains are not equipped for slow moving threats. So that's the only explanation I got for why the populations are still moving into such obviously doomed cities as Miami, Florida. There's one study that showed that real estate values in Miami are starting to change, that a home back from the water is now worth 7% more than a home that is at sea level on the water in Miami. And that's a new change. So it's starting to happen. But you asked about in the next, in the decade, in the next 10 years, I think the one thing that I've learned about science, technology, and people is that everything takes longer than we think. Remember that the dystopian novel 1984 was supposed to have happened by 1984. 2001, The Space Odyssey, we were supposed to be in all these different galaxies by 2001. So everything takes longer than you think. That includes climate change, and that includes climate change adaptation and realization on our humanity's part. So it's coming. Both the problem and the solutions are coming, but they're all going to take longer than you think.
One aspect, where people can perceive a threat as if it's a threat to their livelihood, a threat to their family, a threat to their savings. And I suppose asset prices is one way in which that long-term value sort of starts to become more immediate, because as you said, property prices can start to adjust, relative to those future risks. Not just the insurability question, which I think, you also covered very well. Do you think some buildings, some parts of some cities will start to become uninsurable?
Yeah, you mentioned the Kim Stanley books, and one of them I was reading, what's it called? New York 2040, is that what it's called? It's set in Manhattan after the sea level has risen, and he handles it so brilliantly. Basically, parts of the city turn into Venice. You don't get a taxi, you get a taxi boat to take you downtown. And the bottom floors of these skyscrapers are simply abandoned to the sea. Now the fourth floor is the ground floor. It's just adaptation. And I think that's likely to be what happens. But the insurability thing, to me, that's really terrifying. My wife jokes that I'm a gas at parties because I can go on for 2 hours about flood insurance, but it's true. The insurance thing is really, really interesting. The insurance companies no longer, at least in the United States, and I'm pretty sure Europe, do not insure floods for flooding anymore. So if you have home insurance, it'll cover fire and hurricane and thievery, but they don't cover flooding. So, and it's because it doesn't pay. If you're an insurance company, you can't make money anymore. You'll lose your shirt insuring people for flooding because there's so much flooding. You'll lose money. So starting in 1992, they all got out of the insurance business, and the US government had to get into the flood insurance business. The government now offers people flood insurance, and even that program is tens of billions of dollars in debt because of all these hurricanes we've been having. And the Congress doesn't know what to do about this program. So most of the insurance experts I spoke to anticipate that between fire, because more and more they're not insuring for fire either, and flooding, that pretty soon you won't be able to buy insurance unless it's for the staggering price that only rich people can afford. That insurance will no longer be a thing where it's like, should I get it or should I not get it? It'll be a thing where you can't get it. That to me is a terrifying situation for millions and millions and millions of people. That means that when a climate disaster comes their way, which is happening more often, they're just doomed. Their house is gone and they've got no way to financially recover. So that to me is a terrifying sort of unspoken certainty.
Yep, I agree completely. In the book, you discover weather in the news and that kind of perception of weather. And it strikes me that in general conversation, quite a lot of people, there's a certain black humor about it sometimes. Sometimes people are willing to sort of just shrug it off as being, hey, that's weird. But at what point do you think weird weather becomes frightening, or at least cuts through in a different way? Clearly having your house flooded can do that, but there's still a remarkable propensity for people to find other excuses or other reasons.
Yeah, I've thought and written a lot about this weird anti-science backlash. I don't know what it's like in Hong Kong, but here in the States and in Europe, there are people who don't trust vaccines, any vaccines, COVID, anything, who are afraid of 5G cellular, who don't believe that we are responsible for climate change. And it's weird what people choose to be skeptical about. I mean, there's no such thing as a photosynthesis denier. There's not people who say, oh no, plants don't convert sunlight to sugars. There's not people who say, oh no, ice doesn't turn into water when it melts. That's a hoax. There aren't people who say babies do not come from women. Don't buy that argument. Some things we accept and some things we don't. What's the difference? And I think the sole difference is unfamiliarity. So we grew up with the notions of, babies come out of women's bodies and ice melts. We did not grow up with 5G or vaccines or climate change. These are all new science things that hit us after we became adults. So the answer to your question is repetition, explanation, and familiarity. That is what's going to make people open their eyes. And it's starting to happen with climate change. I mean, for a long time, weather reporters were afraid to use the phrase climate change because they knew it was a controversial topic. They were afraid of viewers turning them off. But we hear it so often these days in casual conversation. The baseball game is being delayed. It's because of the intense heat here, something we didn't have before climate change. But they'll just throw that out there. The more times a person hears a concept, the more they believe that it's real, the more they accept it as familiar instead of unfamiliar. So I see that happening a lot. We are hearing climate change come out of the mouths of so many people so much more often than we did even 5 years ago.
Yeah, it's also sort of numbing, isn't it? I think there's a numbing factor that even though they may have this sense that there's a threat, it's like a throbbing, kind of headache that you learn to live with. And it's only when it becomes a migraine that you go see the doctor or you want to do something about it. Clearly there's a huge amount of bad news around, right? And that in itself becomes something which people begin to deliberately tune out of, because to consume it all the time would actually kind of get them down, quite naturally. And so you develop a technique of either filtering or avoiding or switching off, or finding a way to interpret it that actually just means you can avoid the absorption of what really might be happening. And there's some very interesting sort of psychological effects happening, which I think probably the more that your life could be affected by it, the more you're more likely to develop those defense mechanisms.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that the psychological aspects of the eco disasters that you're talking about are fascinating, and the studies that are being done right now are another reflection that the climate crisis has become mainstream. You asked about what are one of my biggest takeaways from researching the book. Another one was, I used to be the guy at the party who bombards you with statistics. Do you know that this much sea level rise with this many degrees, and we put this many tons of CO2 into the atmosphere? And what I learned hard and fast from that book is, well, as one person put it, you cannot change a person's mind with statistics and facts of an opinion that wasn't originally formed from statistics and facts. So what that means is, if you're trying to change a denier's mind and by bombarding them with studies and facts, you will go backwards. You will simply force them to retrench in their own beliefs. Instead, what you do is you begin with an emotional appeal. You talk about how your kid has nightmares about the end of the world, how your uncle lost his entire crop in the farmland to bizarre flooding. You talk about ways that you are emotionally affected before the person you're talking to will even open their ears. One of these specialists put it like this: people don't care what you know until they know that you care. And I think that's so good. And it's psychology, right? You're right. Bombarding with numbers. And if we were Mr. Spock, if we were perfectly logical beings, then statistics and facts would change minds and would rally us to the cause. But that doesn't work because we're not Mr. Spock. We are creatures of feelings and fears and personal histories. And so we have to learn to approach it differently. And since that, I have never done that again. I have never gone into a David Pogue speech to somebody with a bunch of facts and figures about climate change, because you're right. Their eyes glaze over and you're likely to cause them to retreat instead of winning them to your side.
It kind of explains that science fact that, this anti-science that you spoke about, more and more the science, baffles people or doesn't come from their own knowledge. The more that they use that science argument to try and convince them, the more it just converts into something which is, more, as you said, an emotional reaction or one of obstinacy or something like that, because partly because people feel maybe they don't have a grasp on it, right? So they just revert and say, nah, I feel this, therefore.
That's 100% right. The feeling of there's an inadequacy element too. The feeling, oh, I'm stupid, I don't understand this, so therefore I'm going to shut it out. It's another form of the denial that you were talking about. It's I'm going to make myself numb so I don't have to confront this. And one of the eco-psychologists I spoke to pointed out a number of reasons that people don't want to accept what's happening. That's one, is they feel stupid and feel intimidated. Another is, and maybe this is an American thing, but the American story is of our ancestors coming to America, working hard, building a business. Each generation becomes wealthier than the last. And frequently, it was by doing the things that we're now saying is a mistake. It's burning fossil fuels. It's ravaging resources out of the ground. So you're basically telling people that the entire mythology that their American lives are built on is wrong. Their grandfather who built the train, the railway or worked at the car factory was making a problem worse for us all. No one wants to listen to that. So, and then the third thing is that it's really hard to talk about the end of things and death and suffering and the change of the world as we know it. I learned in researching the book this word solastalgia, which means a longing for a place that you haven't left yet, but it's so different now that it doesn't resemble what you grew up with. So it's a longing for the way a place used to be. So these are all really difficult things psychologically to accept. These are all things that make it hard to approach the changes in the way we wish people would.
Solastalgia, that's my new word for the day. Thanks for that. Yeah, it's a good one. Thank you. So on that same point, the food scarcity, I mean, again, about how it gets through to people, because if facts and figures don't work, then maybe the food they're used to buying, now this is notwithstanding, war-induced shortage, but if you just look at the general patterns of what's likely to come in terms of food disruption from climate change, that when that starts to appear and become discussed in the supermarket, in the market, on the news, some blights that may occur to certain crops that have been, that are affecting prices, those scarcities or those price differences will probably be quite powerful in terms of how people perceive that to be affecting them.
Yeah, I mean, the food scarcity thing is a big one looming, and I think even the biggest optimists will have to admit that things are going to change about where we get our food, what we're going to pay for, where it's grown, and what we're going to eat. The thing that gives me hope on this issue is that science has a long history of adapting to agricultural change. I could do a whole hour on the Haber-Bosch process. This is basically the invention of fertilizer. I don't know if people realize that before the 1800s, we didn't have fertilizer. They used guano, they used bird poop. And there was this huge market of shoveling up bird poop from the shores of South America and shipping it to Europe to use on fields as nature's fertilizer. And so when Fritz Haber and his collaborator Bosch invented fertilizer, they say that 2 billion people on the earth are alive today because of that invention. So it vastly multiplied the effectiveness of growing any crop. You can get a lot more corn, wheat, soybeans, whatever, from a field that's been fertilized than you could in the old days. So the question is, if we could do that again, wouldn't that solve the food scarcity problem? And the answer is yes, it would. So there's a lot of work being done on breeding new kinds of crops that can survive the weather disasters, that can grow and thrive in hotter, drier, or hotter, wetter climates. The farmland itself is moving north. People are talking about Greenland. In fact, Chinese investors are buying up huge plots of land in Greenland as future cropland for the breadbasket of the world. In North America, the farms are shifting northward. And there's these fascinating programs to try to repeat the productivity experiment of the Haber-Bosch equation. I'll just summarize this one. It's out of the University of Illinois. It's called RIPE. It's an acronym, RIPE. And basically, they've discovered that the photosynthesis process, where our plants take sunlight and carbon dioxide and convert it into food for us, is an unbelievably inefficient, badly designed process. I mean, it is something like 2% efficiency. And if we could just genetically breed plants that are a little more efficient, 4% efficient, that's double the productivity for a field. So if this program has even a mild success at engineering better photosynthesis, we get more ears of corn off of every plant, and that goes a long way toward solving the food scarcity issue.
I think there'll be a huge amount of inventiveness. I mean, I think we're both probably optimistic about the innovation that will come. As you said, I think a lot of it won't come in time to avoid some of the worst effects, especially in some parts of the world, and some of the suffering that is for sure coming. But I'm a great believer in the power of human ingenuity and in the fact that we may decarbonize, quicker than people might imagine. We might solve the food issue. I think the big loser for this is the biodiversity and the rest of life on the planet. So we may end up with a world where the wild is severely detrimentally impacted. And there are areas of the world where humans exist relatively comfortably, and then there are areas of the world which are kind of failed or in deep trouble. And that kind of polarization is something that our children may have to get very used to.
Yeah, I would say the two big ones for me are biodiversity loss, as you say. And here again, though, there's a lot of work being done, a lot of great minds working on the problem. And as you hinted earlier, mass migration it's coming. I mean, people who live in the hottest, driest parts of the world aren't going to be able to live there anymore. They will have to go somewhere else by the hundreds of millions over time. And the United States, under Trump was talking about building a wall to keep Mexicans out of the United States. Well, one of my very well-educated, very liberal, very eco-conscious experts for the book said that wall may yet get built because there's going to be so much flooding of humanity from southern, hot, dry, poor areas into Europe, into the United States and Canada, that the existing systems won't be able to handle the influx. I don't know if he's joking or black humor or what, but we do have to anticipate that there's going to be large shifts of humanity who aren't going to observe political boundaries on a map. They need to live. You know, that was one of the big causes. They say that the Syrian war was one of the first climate change wars. And it was because farmers couldn't grow anything in these hot, dry areas. So they had to move into the cities and into areas where they could just stay alive. And that's what triggered some of the conflict.
Yep. I think that's certainly true. And we on Earth.org, we've done some mapping of where those two hot areas live and where they intersect with borders. You know, you're likely to get a lot of friction. Friction could then lead to conflict and in fact war if the states become involved. And I think that's quite a terrifying prospect. And it's particularly in areas which are not very stable already, and especially if you look at the Sahel in Africa, or as I said, across the Indian subcontinent, where there is huge populations, but also quite differing and fractious political relationships, which I think are likely to get exacerbated massively. But that's a geopolitical conversation we can have. I think on from your book, you've spoken about disease and disease factors, and you know, I myself, I'm from the UK. We never used to have Lyme disease when I was a kid.
You're welcome.
We never had it, and it's something which it's coming now in a big way, and I think that's just one example, and you gave many others in the book about essentially mosquitoes and other insect-borne diseases essentially moving into areas where we'll have to, you know, adapt and get used to it.
Yeah, absolutely right. I live in, I'm talking to you from Connecticut, USA, which is about a half an hour from Old Lyme, Connecticut, for which the disease is named. It all started here. We're mighty proud of that. Yeah, Lyme disease, and you know, all the diseases that mosquitoes carry. I mean, so many: malaria, dengue, on and on, are exploding in numbers so great that our government can't even make estimates. They're getting 30,000 cases of Lyme disease a year reported, and they estimate that the actual number is 10 times greater because people just feel sick and don't know what it is. It's probably Lyme disease. It's something to keep our eye on, but it's also remember that the fact that we're sitting here talking about it, and many of the greatest minds are talking about it, is not to be discounted. I have this podcast called Unsung Science. That's just what it sounds like. It's some of the great unheralded scientific breakthroughs. And this guy from Google, let's see if I can do this in 15 seconds. This engineer from Google, he's the guy who wrote Chrome, the web browser. He was worried about this mosquito problem and this disease problem. And he invented a system whereby they built a factory in San Francisco. I visited this. It is insane. They breed hundreds of millions of male mosquitoes that are sterile, and then they release them into the public, into the air. They mate with the females who have eggs, lay eggs. They never hatch. In one summer, they achieved a 98% drop in the mosquito population. And this is a nasty mosquito. This is Aedes aegypti. This is the one that carries all the bad diseases. And that was in a test near San Francisco. Now they're building a similar factory in Singapore, which is basically an island nation and therefore self-contained. So these sterile males will stay where they are. And in Puerto Rico, another island nation, also tropical, also filled with mosquitoes carrying malaria. And so far, the early tests there are showing 98% effectiveness in killing these disease-ridden mosquitoes. And by the way, no genetic engineering involved, none. It's a one-generation thing. You're making these males sterile and then releasing them. Remember, the whole point is that the babies don't hatch. Therefore, there is no genetic modification of the species. If nothing is passed on to the next generation because there isn't a next generation. So completely safe. We've been using this technique with other pest insects for decades. It doesn't, the birds can still eat the mosquitoes. They don't get sick. It's an absolutely ingenious scientific solution that works incredibly well. So I guess what I'm saying is, all the time we sit here worrying and wringing our hands, there are people doing something about it. And some of these experiments are really, really promising.
Yep, let's hope so. I think the world does not need dengue fever, kind of spreading into or Zika or some of the other diseases that you've had it into. And it may be as you said, the wealthy countries that are able to protect themselves and engage in these programs, and the less wealthy that probably end up getting the blunt end of that impact. And so, I think for us, we're I think this equity question is a very interesting subject around how climate change is going to affect the question of equity and lives across the world, not just within countries but across nations and continents. And it seems to me that a new world order is needed to some extent to address that. And in this question, it's a little bit of a left field one, but do you feel that in the future we should consider some form of global administration which can act in a way for the planet's long-term interest? Because at the moment, it's still a situation of petty competitiveness and rivalries, which are dominating and preventing clearly the collaboration that's needed.
Do we need one? Yes. Will it come to pass? I doubt it. I mean, remember, that was the vision of the United Nations, and it's now a largely toothless, empty organization that doesn't really affect much change, doesn't have any real power. I think it's just, the world is just too local. We're never going to trust being governed by somebody who isn't us. Anything could happen if things get bad enough. I mean, more astonishing things have happened. The Berlin Wall did finally fall down, and we did finally close the ozone layer problem, and we did get lead poisoning out of gasoline. So huge environmental issues have been solved before. We are capable of doing it when there's no alternative, and the alternative is death and illness. I suspect that's what's going to happen with the climate crisis. But through my own life and through doing this research, I know that, collaboration and love for our fellow man is not going to be the way it happens. It'll happen through economic pressure and health pressure and self-interest.
Yes, it may take quite a significant crisis in order for that political rethinking to come about. I think I'm totally with you on that. And in the book, just to finish on the last couple of questions, because I know we're coming up to the hour, but it's you have a section on what we should do as parents, on how we can explain and engage with our children on the issues of climate change. We operate After All Kids just for this reason, because we looked around and we actually realized there wasn't that many good resources for kids to look at and read news, unbiased news, and accurate, digestible stories for kids. And I think that's a very interesting education piece. But what are your thoughts on how we as parents should handle this?
I learned a hard lesson from that chapter. I always thought, as a parent, I've got 3 kids, and I always thought the goal was you want to give them the happiest life. You want to shield them from upsetting news. Turns out that's not the right approach with climate change. They are, depending on their age, they're already getting it at school. Or if not in class, they're hearing it from their friends. They're seeing it on YouTube. They're seeing it on TikTok. Your kids already know about the climate crisis. So don't pretend that by not mentioning it at home, you're making the problem go away. In fact, your kid might start to wonder, is this something I should really be scared about, that my parents don't even mention it and everybody else does, you could make the problem worse. So there are, of course, age-appropriate ways to bring it up. You want to start, if they're little kids, you want to just start in nature, with nature, bringing up the seasons, how things work, how the tides come in and out, how ice freezes, just get people conversant in the language of nature. And then as you introduce the subject, you counter everything by, as I have in this conversation, by pointing out what's being done about it. But your mom and dad will always be here with you, will always protect you. And some of the smartest people in the world are trying to solve the problem. That's both truthful and consoling, comforting. But you don't try to hide it, and you don't try to minimize it. When I was growing up, the big thing was the nuclear scare. Every day we knew that Russian missiles were pointed at our heads, and it eventually went away as a threat, but we did have nightmares and we did grow up. Every generation has its bugaboos, and this is the one for the next generation. We created the problem. We can't hide from it. We can tell our kids the truth about our prospects, and some of them are better than the headlines would have us believe, but you got to be truthful.
Yeah, the book does have a chapter to slightly more hopeful, and actually it's titled "Where to Find Hope." It's I think the final chapter, and you do cover some of, I think, the initiatives, some of the kind of headline problems that need to be addressed: population, beef consumption, transport, carbon emissions, carbon pricing, which is one of our personal favorites, if done universally. And I think in this respect, it sort of touches on what we spoke about earlier. When you get a few billion people starting to work in one direction, or tending to go in one direction, that can be a huge amount of pull and change and drive for that change, which I think is where we will start to see positive movements and positive change. So it's not that we're without hope. I think what you're saying, and your book kind of concludes that there is a lot of reasons that things may not be as bad as we expect. However, you're really concluding that there are some things which are inevitable, and it's really about being mentally prepared and also practically prepared for those.
Could not have put it better. That's exactly the message, is that there are things that have changed and can't go back. So be ready for them. Don't pretend that everything's the same. Take some resilient steps to protect you, your home, and your family now, and buy yourself time.
Yeah, I think so. On your last page, you asked the reader, will you throw your weight around by the way you vote, shop, invest, and speak? I suppose it's up to all of us to become active in this issue, and actually that can make a huge difference. Do you think, in the end, can we humans get ourselves out of this mess?
Well, again, that's that yes or no question that I reject as an implausible question. It's a spectrum. It's a path, and the question is, where will we land on it, and by what year are you asking? So, will the human race go extinct from climate change? No. We will solve enough of it that we will not go extinct. Will there need to be massive changes in the lifestyle we've had for the last few decades? Yes, that will have to change. There are a lot of people who will have a harder life. But when we come out of it, whether it's 100 years from now or 200 years from now, what we'll have is a limitless, endless, pollution-free source of power and food. And we will, our descendants will look back on this transition as a really difficult, maybe painful one, but one that we did make to ensure the survival of the species.
Excellent. On that note, thank you very much, David. It's been an absolute pleasure to meet you and to talk. And I'm sure we could have talked for a lot longer, but it's been great to have you on this interview. And we'll look forward to certainly the book. I recommend it. It's an excellent read, and one that should be on every household's bookshelf. And so thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.